Welcome, everyone, and to the Climate Action Dialogue's Indigenous and Global South Perspectives on Just Transition. This event is part of KAIROS Climate Action Week, which runs from June 5th to 11th under the theme Decolonizing Climate Action. This week's focus is on centering Indigenous ways of knowing. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that many of us are gathering today on the traditional territories of Indigenous people across Turtle Island. We pay respects to the traditional guardians of the land upon which we live, work, and play. I acknowledge that I am joining you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples on the banks of the Kitchissippi River, also known as the Ottawa River. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are the traditional guardians of Turtle Island on the land also known as Canada. We recognize their long-standing and ongoing relationship with this territory, which includes unceded and traditional land, and acknowledge our duty to walk with and alongside reconciliation and decolonization efforts. As a settler, I believe I have a responsibility to continually engage in a journey to reassess and reconsider my position in the spaces I occupy, to learn how to embody allyship and to use my voice to speak out against systemic injustices experienced by Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation is an ongoing process requiring unlearning colonial practices and history alongside relearning our shared past, present, and future. At this time, I invite you to take a moment to place your feet on the ground as you are able, and take a moment to acknowledge the territory where you are joining us from today. Thank you. A few housekeeping notes for today's webinar. The event is being recorded, thankfully that I remembered to start that. We will only record the speaking portions of the session, so the breakout room discussions will not be recorded. We ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentations. We will invite you to ask questions to the speakers using the chat. Following each presentation, we'll have about 5 minutes for questions before moving into our small group discussions. And so we will begin today. I wanted to start things off with a quick poll to gauge our audience's understanding of just transition. And so I'm going to launch that poll right now and ask you to just respond to those questions. That's great. I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. So that's great. So the majority of us have heard of the term just transition before joining this webinar today. So that's wonderful. It appears that many of you have kind of a general idea or are able to explain the term to others. So I think this will allow us to have a really good, robust conversation and discussion on just transition. So thank you for that. As many of you may know, the federal government in Canada is set to table its just transition legislation soon. The Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, describes this legislation as an action plan for sustainable jobs. And earlier this year, the government released the Sustainable Jobs Plan as a precursor to that legislation. In the plan, the government notes its decision to shift away from using the term just transition, stating that the term sustainable jobs is more appropriate in the Canadian context. We believe there is something lost in narrowing the focus of just transition discourse to jobs only. The term just transition was first coined in the 1990s by North American labor unions developing programs to support workers who were losing their jobs due to environmental protection policies, but it has come to mean much more than that. Indigenous leaders, environmentalists, labor unions, faith leaders in both the global North and the global South envision just transition as a transformation of society that supports equity, human rights, and an economy of life. These groups understand that just transition must address the dominant systems of colonialism and extractivism that have caused climate change. Principles like those set out in the LEAP Manifesto and the Indigenous Environmental Network's Indigenous Principles of a Just Transition prioritize this broader vision by placing rights, equity, environmental protection, and an economy of care ahead of corporate values and economic growth. In many ways, just transition is about resetting relationships between the global North and global South, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, between humans and the Earth. Today's speakers will share more about this broader vision, and then we will discuss how to carry this vision forward in our collective climate advocacy efforts. And it is my immense pleasure to be joined by Noble Wadzah and Bryanna Brown as our speakers for today. And so I am going to introduce Noble Wadzah, who will speak first. Noble has over 22 years of experience in environmental and social development and holds a master's degree in development studies, along with several related diplomas and certificates. Noble has a vast knowledge and experience working in civil society on targeted policy and advocacy campaigns at local and international levels. He was a member of the Public Interest and Accountability Committee and then elected as chair. This committee provides transparency and accountability in the management of petroleum revenues in Ghana, where he is based. Noble is an active player in climate justice movements in Africa and associated energy transition and fossil-free development discourse. He has used his voice to raise concerns regarding the nexus between fossil energy, climate change, and poor development outcomes, as well as the social and environmental consequences of the West Africa and Chad-Cameroon pipelines. Currently, Noble leads Oil Watch Ghana, a chapter of Oil Watch Africa, where he acts as a steering committee member. Oil Watch Africa is a KAIROS solidarity partner. Thank you so much for joining us today, Noble, and sharing your expertise with us. And I'm now going to pass things over to you.
So, thank you, Beth. Is it good afternoon, good morning, good day, everybody from every part of the world because of different time zones? I'm glad to be on this platform today. And yeah, it's just to hit the ground. I'm glad to say that the issue of just transition has become a cliche, at least has become a cliche in this recent time, particularly post climate change. The COP in Egypt, it has become a buzzword now going around, and I think it is important for us to understand and associate with what the whole issue about the just transition is about. And I think from my part of the world, is the just transition is calling for a global attention towards a redefinition development paradigm that addresses issues of injustice, colonial extractivism, and repair societies and communities that have suffered damages associated with unbridled resource exploitation from the south to the global north. I think it is important for us to connect with this understanding in order to propel the just aspects of the transition. Otherwise, there's the potential, high potential that we risk perpetuating the current injustices associated with resource extraction from the global south into the envisaged transition realm. And I think it is important that this understanding is very clear to everybody from community level to states to regional bodies and international bodies and governments in the global north as well as the global south. Yeah, so I want to end it here.
Thank you, Noble. Could you share maybe a bit more with us about, just some of the kind of policy work that's being done to plan for just transition in Ghana and maybe in the wider kind of West Africa region?
Okay, Beth, I think that, like I said earlier on, it has become a buzzword, so everybody's trying to associate with it in one form or the other. And associating with it in the context of Ghana, which I can use as a case study to represent probably what is happening in other parts of West Africa. And I know Nigeria is also doing the same thing like Ghana in terms of trying to put up an energy transition policy framework. From the Ghanaian perspective, the policy framework was done in a very hurried manner. And in our perspective, in the perspective of some civil society groups, including Oil Watch, we believe that it was being done to satisfy the global call. In so doing, the framework or the policy design appeared to have glossed over some critical issues that are of critical concern to the transition spirit. So, and you believe that, you may believe or you may know that the Ghana energy transition policy was even launched in the Egypt meeting, in the COP in Egypt, when citizens themselves were not even aware. So again, we have started a situation where citizens will be hoodwinked to a situation that they are not part of. And that has begun with the transition policy. And the transition policy framework, which we have now, is riddled with a number of challenges in terms of its ability and its ability to really address the core values of the energy transition in general. So, for instance, there are issues of the transition policy that is still looking at industry-led transition. We have a policy that is opening the doorway for corporate takeover. We have a policy that is not designed to be run by the states. So from the word go, it appears to me that we are getting it a bit wrong, and we need to redirect our energies into doing it very well, to getting it right. And until we do that, we are creating an opportunity for perpetuating the current injustices, like I said earlier on, in the current energy extraction model and in the mining and oil and gas sectors into the future energy realm. And I think that these are of critical concern, and I'm sure that we have spotted these gaps very early enough to warrant attention for redress.
Thank you. Yeah, I encourage if anyone has some questions for Noble to put them in the chat, and I'll just follow up with another question. In kind of noticing these gaps and in your work with communities, what are people on the ground, like in community, those who are impacted by the effects of climate change? I know the concept of just transition is just becoming part of the conversation, but what are people in community hoping to see through the energy transition? Like, what is their vision or their hopes that could be reflected within a kind of more robust energy policy, transition policy?
Yeah, on the wider scale, communities who are even the suppliers of most of the resources that feeds the center to mean the country or the state level, are people who are disenfranchised when it comes to energy distribution. So what they are looking for through our interactions with them is they are looking for an energy redistribution, a system of redistribution of energy resources that everybody has access, and in a way that is not expensive, that can meet their local and domestic consumption needs, which is what they are not having. Meanwhile, they are the bane of some of the products that we consume in the cities. They have become the farms that produces the food and even the energy that we use. Their spaces are encumbered for energy extraction, yet they are dispossessed from the very resources that they are given to us. So basically, these communities are only looking to a fair share of the resources that's cutted from their community or their backyards for the consumption needs of the elites and probably even the global north. So they have been looking for these opportunities because they are trapped, they are in islands, people are situated in unreached communities who are dispossessed. The people have to go to bed as early as 6 a.m. or at times even earlier, but they don't have power. So that is the general situation and conditions of people who are the real suppliers of the resources that.
Thanks. And I'm just, some questions have started to come in. Thank you very much for starting to pose those. There's a question here. Are you familiar with WOMAN, which is actually another KAIROS solidarity partner, but maybe you could speak to some of the organizations that you work with in the region that are, partnering with Oil Watch on just transition. And there's also a question here from Radia. How can countries around the world, such as Canada, support African countries to transition at their own pace? So maybe if you could speak to that as well.
Yeah, I think that that question is very critical for the entire African continent. I think the first point of call may be to go to the climate finance, what the climate finance is about, and how that financing mechanisms can be made available to countries without strings. That the climate finance should be structured in a way that governments and communities who matter most get access to it to deal with the energy situation on ground level. So we are interested in this. Our proposal from civil society is that we do not want a climate finance that is administered in a fashion of a loan as pertains in the context of the World Bank transactions. We think that will not be fair to us, and we think that this financing mechanism should be distinguished from the development aid or development support that comes to countries. So we think that it should be a dedicated fund, and its administration should be based on fairness and transparency, and so that government can easily assess it and do what is necessary for countries and communities. And I think that is the first point of call. Again, I think the developed countries also have we think that they have a responsibility to support developing countries' energy needs in terms of energy infrastructure development, technology, and even financing beyond even the climate finance. For instance, a country like Canada, United States, and the rest who have historically benefited from the resources from the global south historically over time. I think it is just fair that they make a portion of their national budgets towards supporting the energy needs of developing countries.
Thank you so much. There's another question here that perhaps you might be able to answer. What role are churches or communities of faith playing in Ghana and perhaps in the wider West Africa region in advocating for a true just transition? So would you be able to speak to that?
Sure. The role of churches has always been to reach values and speak to or preach the issues of spiritual connectivity to development and human existence, and also social and cultural values that supports harmonious development of society. So far, the issue of the just transition is yet to catch up with the churches in the context in which we see it, because people see just transition debate as a development debate devoid of religious encumbrances. And I think that, yes, I've heard some pastors, religious leaders talk about resource redistribution. I think they're on that path, but it is not yet strong on the pulpits. Energy transition is not yet too strong on the pulpits, and I think that is a field we have to, or it's a gap that has to be filled. But I'm happy that we have started some work with faith-based organization network. I've forgotten the name exactly, 2-3 months ago, where this issue came up strongly. So the agenda is to work closely with religious bodies to give them a briefing on the whole energy transition within the context of human existence, which touches on the spiritual values of mankind, and link it to historical evolutions of disenfranchisement of populations and stuff like that. So I think that, yes, we are spotted, Ghanaians have spotted that arena, but more work has to be done to realize the essence.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. There's another question here. What do you see as the role of reparations in this transition? So I know you spoke a little bit just briefly to that earlier, but if
what do you see as the role of reparations in the just transition? Yes, I think that probably I've mentioned it, but maybe I didn't emphasize it too strong. Like I said, the just transition, like I said earlier on, must ensure that it is done in a way that promotes social justice, that promotes transparency and accountability to resource host countries. And the just transition must be used as a basis to repair damages that have been caused historically through unbridled resource extraction. So that can also reflect in the financing and technological transfer mechanisms from the global south to the global north, from the global north to the south. And like I said earlier on, we are envisioning a situation where the climate financing will be amenable to ensuring that damages are repaired. And communities that have suffered from historical exploitation of resources, the impact of historical exploitation of resources, the damages, they are repaired, the damages are repaired, and people, if there is the way the communities can even be restored, because some communities have completely been extracted from their spiritual and cultural existence to unknown destinations, or to destinations that are not in tune with their very essence of existence. So there are issues of damage, first restoration and remediation. And these are issues that should catch the eye of development thinking, which should reflect in our policies and legislations across country levels, community levels, country level, regional levels, and international levels. And I think that there must be an understanding. There must be an understanding of the issues at the global north, because the world is a community now, and the role of everybody is important in ensuring that there is justice. And understanding getting justice done, you have to understand the value of what you have to pursue. So I think some of these issues of reparations, managing the damages, restoration, and all the rest are issues that should catch the political ideology of all the players, the big players, including the global north. Then it can be reflected in our policy legislations and programs. Then it can cascade down to community level. That is how probably we can begin to achieve some level of success in what has been damaged over centuries.
Thank you. Yeah, and as many as some of you may know, or many of you know, this year is a big year for building what that loss and damage funding could look like. It was announced at last year's COP that this fund would be set up, and so now we're in this critical moment before the next COP in the fall to really inform that and uplift, you know, this what Noble has just shared with us. In how that funding looks. So, you know, stay tuned for more actions that we might be able to take together to inform that process. But I really appreciate you sharing that with us, Noble. An old friend here, Jim Davis, in the chat, it was just wondering if the network you spoke of, the faith-based network, was the Fellowship of Christian Councils and Churches in West Africa. We wanted to know if that was the network you spoke of earlier.
Yeah, not exactly so.
Okay.
No, this not yet, but this is one of the targets we have identified to reach out to. In our profiling, the Fellowship of Christian Councils in West Africa has been identified, but that is when we are able to carry the message at regional level. Now we started working from the country level, and we think that we have to identify other colleagues and allies in the space in maybe Nigeria, Ghana, and other West African countries. Then we can make a reach to the West African units, as you have rightly identified here. So, Jim, yes, we have identified this institution as an area, as a focus to work towards, and it's good we have brought it up again. It's in our scheme of thoughts. But we have to go as a regional bloc in order to make it.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. And so there's a question here if you have comments on the COP that took place on biodiversity, which was held in Canada last December, and maybe just to expand on that, what you are noticing in Ghana in terms of the impacts on biodiversity from climate change.
Can you come up again, please? Do you have any comment on that?
So yeah, there was a specific COP that took place just on biodiversity loss and just the impacts we're seeing from climate change on, you know, the loss of species, animals and plants and birds. This happened last December, and just wondering if you have any comments on what you've noticed in Ghana or in the region.
Well, I have not followed that particular COP in detail, but I think in the general context of loss and damage, the biodiversity loss is an issue here. And that biodiversity loss is not in isolation of the general trend of resource extraction. So, for instance, the forest sector, Ghana has lost patches of its forest estates over time, which is a worry to the country now. And in that, we have also lost some, not only the forest resources, but biodiversity in the forest sphere. And that is not, Ghana is not alone in this situation. I think Nigeria, because the whole West Africa is suffering from that. But again, that is also connected with the trade volumes of resources that is leaving the forest resources that we are always exporting. So it is an issue of trade, and it's an issue of course, not trade alone, but unbalanced trade arrangements, which is leading to, so it's like the forest resources are being carted to whet the appetite of some other consumers when the biodiversity is suffering over here. So the rainfall patterns have changed in the forest, critical forest zone that we all know of, the villages that some of us grew up. These days you go, you don't find the rainfall pattern. It's within the context of the general climate change, but the forest sector is also playing this role in that negative way. So yes, there are issues of REDD, which some of us are very critical about. We think that the REDD is not the red is not addressing the fundamental issues of forest integrity. And that is a worry, and that has pitched, how do I call it, a wedge between civil society and government, because government is looking at money, thinking that they can get some benefit from direct financial benefit from this arrangement, but that is not addressing the core mandate that is required for reversing the climate impact through forest degradation, management of forest degradation. So we think that, yeah, the whole biodiversity issue is still a worry. It's just as what we see in the coastal areas, coastal erosion is a similar trend. I've not followed the COP in detail, that particular one in detail, the biodiversity, but I understand the connections.
Mm-hmm. No, I appreciate yeah, you drawing those connections and sharing your observations on that. I think, yeah, it's being felt everywhere, those losses. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Noble. I thank you to everyone in our audience today for asking some really thoughtful questions, and to Noble for your thoughtful responses. Bryanna Brown is Inuk from Nunatsiavut, Labrador. She is the originator of the Land Back movement to advocate for sovereignty in BIPOC communities and to promote land ownership and reclamation as a means of environmental protection and self-determination. Bryanna is a policy advisor, traditional storyteller, and knowledge keeper who has held speaking engagements across Canada and internationally. She is on Indigenous Climate Action's National Steering Committee, and it is important to her that she continues to always advocate for the rights of women, Indigenous peoples, environmental justice in relation to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples and persons with disabilities, as someone with lived experience, with efforts to change public policy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bryanna, and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for speaking with us as well, Noble. I really enjoyed your presentation. Before talking about me, I would like to acknowledge that I'm currently on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, also known as Ottawa, Ontario. I would like to acknowledge the ancestors that came before me, who had passed on the traditional knowledge that I'm able to share today. And I pray that we do our best to combat climate change so that this traditional knowledge can be passed on to the next 7 generations to come. I would also like to acknowledge everyone's personal land, which is your bodies and the energy that surrounds it. And I wish good health, blessings, clear consciousness, and peace upon you. So thank you for your time and presence today. I hope everyone is safe in their environments that they're in. I know there's a lot of various issues happening with the environment due to climate change, and especially the wildfires happening here in Ontario. So I hope everybody is doing well, and I hope that they're safe. And I also would like to acknowledge that it is Indigenous Peoples Month as well as Pride. So speaking about a just transition from an Indigenous perspective, a just transition refers to a comprehensive and equitable shift from an unsustainable and extractive economy to a sustainable and regenerative one. I would like to provide a disclaimer. I forgot. My jaw doesn't work sometimes, so I stutter because years ago I was hit by a car, and I'm recovering from a severe concussion and severe TMJ. So sometimes my brain doesn't send the signals to the nerves to move properly. So if I stutter, that's usually why. But anyways, a just transition is a concept rooted in recognition of Indigenous rights and human rights, which includes Black peoples as well, as they are inherently Indigenous. It also includes sovereignty and traditional knowledge systems. For Indigenous communities, a just transition goes beyond the economic aspects and encompasses cultural, social, and environmental dimensions. It involves respecting and revitalizing Indigenous ways of life, preserving ancestral lands and waters, and upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples to self-determination and decision-making over lands and resources. Key principles identified of a just transition from an Indigenous perspective include Indigenous self-determination, cultural revitalization, environmental stewardship, social justice and equity, community empowerment and engagement, and economic diversification and development. It is important to note that the specific vision and priorities of a just transition may vary among Indigenous communities, as each community has its own unique cultural, social, and environmental context. Therefore, it is crucial to involve Indigenous voices, amplify the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of the global majority, those who are Two-Spirit, and those living with disabilities. It's also important to involve their leadership in shaping the transition process to ensure it aligns with their distinct needs, aspirations, and ways of life. As we look into the future, what is important in achieving a just transition is changing how we are positioned to make positive contributions by addressing false solutions and operationalizing allyship to Black and Indigenous peoples and those who experience social inequities at extreme rates. Addressing how colonization affects us in our thinking, as well as our proximity to whiteness, is important. It may be necessary to decolonize our worldviews and essentially understand the fragmentation that has occurred. To deny the impacts of colonization on Indigenous worldviews would only contribute to the solidification of colonized perspectives. In contrast, engaging in a just transition from an Indigenous perspective would allow for us to resort to solutions based in Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge to protect the lands and waters for future generations to come. When it comes to a culture of colonization and capitalism, these systems are very power hungry, promoting individualism, greed, and marketing to make you feel that you do not have enough or that you are not good enough, enforcing the idea that you need to consume their products marketed to you exponentially. To oppose this, what is important is taking back your power to be able to invest it into efforts involving transmuting and alchemizing that energy, and to look within to heal and decolonize your own ways of thinking, and especially assess your proximity to whiteness. Colonialism caused climate change. Indigenous rights are the solution. We must take our power back from normalized abuses taught by the actions imposed by governmental heads of state, through policies made for the purpose to police those who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, or as I like to say, people of the global majority, and especially those who are women, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA+, and those living with disabilities. These same normalizations of abuse through systems transcend into the individual relationships that we have on a daily basis. And a way to reconnect to our inner selves would be cultural revitalization, connection to spirit, and connection to the land. So I would like to also speak about the principles of a just transition again. So one is Indigenous self-determination, recognizing and respecting the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to govern their own affairs, make decisions about their lands and resources, and shape the future. Two, cultural revitalization, promoting the revitalization and preservation of Indigenous cultures, languages, traditional knowledge systems, and practices. This includes supporting Indigenous-led education, language revitalization programs, and the transmission of intergenerational knowledge. Three is environmental stewardship, prioritizing ecological integrity and sustainability in all economic activities. This involves transitioning away from fossil fuels, reducing pollution and resource extraction, and promoting sustainable practices rooted in Indigenous knowledge and land management and conservation. Something that is an issue with Inuit, particularly that we've been speaking about today with the National Inuit Climate Change Committee that I work with as a policy advisor, is the issue of infrastructure and housing in Inuit Nunangat. So in the 4 land claims regions, Inuit land of Inuit Nunangat, there's a lot of issues that we are currently experiencing with infrastructure and housing. There's a lack of those facilities available for Inuit to be able to move to the communities, to our own communities, to be able to work in positions and occupations that would contribute to climate action. And also another issue is the emissions reductions plan. So this is causing huge issues with Inuit. The Canadian government is seeking to impose carbon taxes on the consumer. So it isn't, which would be increasing fuel costs to Inuit in isolated regions, and the cost of food transportation to communities as well. So these issues are very important to be cognizant of. And another point is social justice and equity. So addressing historical and ongoing injustice faced by Indigenous communities, including poverty, marginalization, and systemic discrimination. A just transition must ensure equitable access to education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and social services for Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have been denied these human rights for many, many years and continue to today, which also this accumulation of the denial of human rights causes the issue of human trafficking affecting Indigenous women at the highest rate, especially in Ontario. Statistically, Inuit women being the most affected. Secondly, First Nations women, and then Black women and women who are coming to Canada, newcomers to Canada. So climate change, climate action is something that holistically through a just transition would hopefully address these issues as well. 5 is community empowerment and engagement. So involving Indigenous communities at all stages of decision-making processes, from policy development to project implementation. This requires meaningful consultation, free, prior, and informed consent, and partnership based on mutual respect and benefit sharing. And 6 is economic diversification and development, supporting sustainable economic development initiatives that are, that are aligned with the, Indigenous values and perspectives. So based on my experience, the ideas that keep me motivated is creating actionable avenues in which the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples can be implemented in all areas, institutions, and organizations globally. There are approximately 370 million Indigenous peoples today, representing thousands of languages and cultures across the world. Indigenous lands make up around 20% of the Earth's territory, containing 80% of the world's biodiversity. Assign Indigenous peoples are most effective stewards of the environment. Although committing to the agreements of the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples, it remains to be seen how the federal government intends to actionize consultation and seek free, prior, and informed consent in impact assessments, or meet the 26 articles outlined in the UNDRIP Act. Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge incorporation and true engagement opportunities are being overlooked despite growing evidence that a combination of scientific and Indigenous knowledge is necessary to effectively address localized environmental issues. As people, we are not voiceless. We are excluded from decision-making tables due to structural barriers. ensuring funding to organizations that actually help the people to actionize under it would also address calls to action in the National Action Plan on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The exploitation of natural resources and the land have a direct link to the exploitation of our sacred Black and Indigenous women as well. So thank you so much. I think I had some more, but for now I would like to just stop. So thank you so much. Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, thanks, Bryanna. Yeah, if there are questions, please start to put them in the chat, and we will ask them to Bryanna. I just wanted to thank you for sharing kind of this beautiful roadmap for a just transition and all the principles you shared. I wonder if you, just to kind of get the ball rolling with questions, if you could just maybe share what your expectations are for the just transition legislation that is slated to come out soon in the coming months.
Something that I guess I don't really have expectations. The main reason is that it is legislation that is presented by the very system that had caused violence through acts of colonization from the government. So expecting the exact solution from those who had caused the issue, I think is very difficult for me. And I think that that's something that Noble had been getting to as well, that the people are those who should be making those decisions and being able to have that power. But oftentimes we are overlooked and not included. So I would hope for more inclusion of Indigenous peoples, as well as our involvement in these decision-making tables more. I know that that's something that in my work, that's something that we had been working on. However, there are still many systemic barriers that is causing a disconnect, and it's really difficult as due to these social injustices that we face as Indigenous peoples. It's often difficult to even just get into positions to be able to be honored as decision makers or be invited. So that's something that I would look forward to, but I know that realistically, there's a lot more work that needs to be done to address barriers in all areas, like access to healthcare, just things that you would need for to be able to maintain yourself in a basic way, like food security or housing or healthcare, many things like that. And especially there needs to be a lot more efforts, I believe, to address ongoing colonial violence. And it's something that we haven't fully figured out. I think it would be really naive to believe that it can just be fixed based on legislation. Thank you so much for that question.
Welcome, and thank you for your response. There's a question here in the chat. What would you like to see? So knowing that many of the people gathered here on the call today or on this webinar might be from a Christian community or a Christian church in Canada. And so the question is, what would you like to see and hear from Christian churches and other faith communities in Canada? And I'll maybe just add kind of like in uplifting some of those principles that you shared.
That's a really good question. I haven't thought about that one a lot. I guess it depends on many Indigenous people's relationship to Christianity. I think that is very confusing given the history of residential schools. My grandparents are very much practicing Christians. And there's a lot of controversy when working with various First Nations or other Indigenous groups and their organizations when it comes to those questions. And I have participated in various conferences and speaking engagements where that question has come up. And I think that a lot of people's intentions are very, very well. But I think that listening to Indigenous peoples is one of the most important things that we can do. Also, not imposing rigid ways of thinking upon people or judgment upon people is very, very important, and to be able to keep an open mind and assess within our own inner selves what prejudices may be there that may be unconscious or that you may be blind to, that may impact your ability to create relationships with people in a way that there is equitable understanding towards the experiences, the historical violence that they've experienced, and ways that you can uplift their voices or uplift the work of Indigenous peoples, not in a way to only benefit, to just be of benefit to yourself or reputation, but to actually genuinely partake in uplifting the people who need it most. So I think a lot of people do have good intentions, but I think it's most important that they understand the history and break down barriers within their own worldviews or ways of thinking first, to be able to make really good, solid connections, and to be able to have genuine connections, to be able to work together and see each other eye to eye for who we truly are as not only spirits, I mean, not only humans in the flesh, but in spirit and in our souls, and those types of energies as well.
Thank you. There's a question here that might just kind of add on to that. And as you may know, there's a lot of connections to the blanket exercise in this space today as well. And the question is, do you think the blanket exercise may help?
I'm so sorry. I think that is that has been, I might be miseducated, but is that more of a practice for that First Nations people have been practicing? I've never done it before.
Oh,
so
sorry. Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. No, that's fine. I made an assumption. So
it's okay.
So the blanket exercise is a KAIROS and initiated kind of activity that walks, it's kind of an experiential learning activity that walks people through the history on the land of Turtle Island, you know, from time immemorial to point of contact to more recently through kind of the residential school experience, and walks people through that history in a way. So yeah, I think it's just one of those tools perhaps that can speak to what you said about kind of going beyond intentions and learning history and making those connections. But yeah, I won't put you on the spot there if that is a new thing to you. Great. Well, I think we are going to move on now to our small group discussions. And I just want to thank you again, Bryanna, for sharing your words with us. It was really, again, just a beautiful roadmap for where we can kind of go from here. So yeah, thank you again to everyone too in the room for sharing your questions with our speakers. We are now going to ask some questions of you and move into our discussions for the day. We'll spend about 10 to 15 minutes in the breakout rooms, and we have prepared some questions for you to consider. My colleague Cheryl is going to put them in the chat, but I'm also just going to read them out loud right now. When our time is up in the breakout rooms, we'll come back together to share some of the reflections with the broader group, given the time that we have left together. So we'll still aim to wrap up around 1:30 Eastern. So the questions to you, The first question, which actually comes from Noble, is we need to ensure that the energy transition does not lead to resource plunder in the global south by the global north. What mechanisms should be in place to protect against this type of resource colonization, and how can we advocate for them? The second question is, do you face any challenges talking about just transition in your community? And 3, what elements of a just transition or social transformation would be the most significant for your community? So we are going to go into breakouts of about four to five people. And you'll receive a warning when it's time to come back. We're just going to assign these automatically. So if you, yeah, please just when you receive the invitation to go into one of the rooms, just respond to that, and then we'll come back together in about 15 minutes. And Cheryl will share those questions with everyone in the chat. Great, welcome back, everyone. Just giving everyone a moment to pop back in from their breakout rooms. It's great. I think we've reached everyone. We have a few moments just to, if anyone feels compelled to share an insight or a key reflection from their discussion, I would just invite you to raise your hand, and I can call on you to do that. If you feel more comfortable sharing something in the chat, please do so that way. Everyone's still reflecting and pondering. Well, maybe as folks are thinking about what they might want to share, maybe I'll also make another invitation to you. I would invite you to just share in the chat in a word or two, your vision or a key element of just transition that is really significant to you. So I think a lot of those pieces, those elements have been shared by our speakers today. Maybe in things that you have read and learned about before coming to today's program. I would love to just see that collective vision brought forward by everyone here in this room. So if you have a key word that represents something you'd like to see in a just transition, I invite you to put that in the chat, and we'll find a way to compile all of those and share them with the group following today's webinar. That's great. I see. So yeah, Bryanna, she mentioned that the group spoke about the relationship between the Just Transition Principles and the TRC Calls to Action, UNDRIP, and the National Action Plan on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Plus, that wonderful. I would love to hear what was shared about that relationship. But that, like, there is so many common pieces there that I feel like, yeah, implementing all of those pieces is part of the just transition. It's great. We're starting to see a few of those comments too coming in about a vision for just transition. So really appreciate. I'm seeing non-performative, follow the money, deep respect for all life. And a comment from one of the discussion rooms, we concluded it would be helpful to help people to think more long-term. Yes, that sounds key. Often our thoughts are very short-term, election cycle driven. We need to have something more long-term. Great. Well, as I continue, oh, okay, another comment in the group that education was key. The group that I popped into very briefly, there was discussion around just having open and honest dialogue, and the words from our speakers around listening to voices and just respecting different positions on this is really key to the process. Thank you, Bryanna, for that comment. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I feel really warm and welcome energy, and just blessed to have the time to meet with you today. Thanks for sharing that. Mary Ellen shared, we need structures for accountability in all countries. Structures must be give them more power to bring those responsible for injustice to court and accountability. Noble shared, a just transition must commit to avoiding the current injustices in the transition era envisaged. Loa shared, education is most important, especially scientific perspectives. This is all really, really great. Thank you so much for sharing this. I'll save all of this and we'll find a way to share it with all of you, and hope that it gives you hope and perhaps informs your future learning and maybe your own kind of advocacy actions on just transition. We're going to kind of move into our conclusion for today, and I would just like to begin with a huge thank you to Noble and Bryanna for sharing their expertise and wisdom with us today. Thank you for enriching this discussion on just transition. Thank you to all the helpers behind the scene, my colleagues, Rachel, Radia, Cheryl, and Shannon, for your behind the scenes support for today's webinar. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this important conversation and for engaging in Climate Action Week. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on this event. And we're going to share a link in the chat right now to a brief survey. We plan to host a Climate Action Dialogue event during our upcoming Climate Action Weeks in the fall. So there'll be 2 more Climate Action Weeks, one in September and November. So please stay tuned for the details on those. Cheryl has just added that link to the evaluation form. I encourage you to just open it up right now. It'll take 1 to 2 minutes to respond to, and your feedback will help us strengthen and inform those future events. As you fill out that survey, I'll just share a few announcements. So there will be a recording available of today's webinar. It will be available on the KAIROS YouTube page and will be shared with you in a follow-up email. That email will also include some of the links that we're sharing in the chat with you right now. Climate Action Weeks continues tomorrow with updates from some of the delegates that formed the KAIROS and For the Love of Creation joint delegation to COP27 in Egypt last November. On Friday, we'll share stories and updates from another KAIROS solidarity partner, Kajiaj Pop in Guatemala. On Saturday, we'll wrap up the week with a sacred teaching shared by our colleague Connor Sarazin. So we encourage you to visit the KAIROS blog every day this week for those new posts. Tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Eastern, KAIROS will host its monthly leadership seminar. This month's seminar will focus on climate action, and we'll discuss what we've been learning this week and share ideas on how to amplify and integrate Indigenous ways of knowing in our advocacy efforts. This event is open to all. It's a very kind of informal space. So we encourage anyone to come. Please register using the link that Cheryl has just put in the chat. And if you have not already done so, please take a moment to sign our letter calling on senators to support swift passage of Bill C-226. This is the National Strategy on Environmental Racism and Environmental Justice Act. The bill has somewhat stalled in the Senate at second reading. And so we need senators to know that Canadians support legislation to address environmental racism. And we want them to act on that now and hopefully before they recess for the summer. So please sign that letter using the link in the chat and invite others to sign on too. And I just wanted to thank you all again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again at our Climate Action Week in the fall. Thanks, everyone.